Hey everyone, and welcome to Travel Through Stories. My name is Sean, and today I want to talk about Thóra Hjörleifsdóttir's new novel, Magma, translated from the Icelandic by Meg Matich. This is Thóra's first novel, but she's a pretty established poet in Iceland. She's a part of the poetry collective Svikaskáld, or Imposter Poets, which is a collective of female Icelandic poets based in Reykjavik who have sort of banded together to embolden themselves against their own self-doubts and actually publish the poetry that they write. They're feminists, obviously, but they reject the label of a feminist poetry collective as they argue that their goals are more artistic rather than political. And they have a full manifesto, which I'll link below, which is quite interesting. But the reason I bring up this poetry collective at the start of a review of Thóra's new book is because this book seems to be coming out of a very similar context. That is, an urban, feminist, kind of underground context that eschews traditional structures, forms, subject matters, etc. And Magma is a wonderful blend of poetic and political art. This book, perhaps unlike the poetry of the Imposter Poets, is unequivocally political, but it's also an artistic masterclass on how politics and art can blend together and work to peel away and unearth deep truths about us and about the society that we built. This book is told through a series of vignettes, most of which are only a page or two. The language is very poetic, and each chapter kind of works as its own stanza, but it also creates a kind of diary effect in which Lilia, our protagonist and narrator, is sort of confiding in us or confessing to us all of these problems that she's having in her relationship. And I should note here, before I go into too many more details, that if you're thinking of picking up this book or continuing to listen to this review, content warning for all different forms of abuse. Further, this book does depict some pretty graphic sexual encounters that I do think are actually really well written, in that they're used to get at deeper points about the pornification of love, as Thóra calls it. As well as this book also mentions sexual abuse and suicidal ideation, so fair warning. Magma begins with a dedication that makes its political and societal goals pretty clear. This account is fiction, populated by characters who speak to the realities that women have long lived in silence. Shame and isolation thrive in that silence. If it isn't broken, this story will continue to repeat itself. I dedicate this book to those who have spoken out. This book is, in many ways, a product of the #MeToo movement. That movement was also like magma, sort of bubbling and flowing with red-hot lava just beneath the Earth's surface, or beneath our social consciousness, until it erupted. And this metaphor of magma bubbling beneath the surface is obviously a pretty important motif and metaphor for the rest of this book. This book is, on the surface, about love. It's about a university student named Lilia who falls in love with this man who is very self-confident, intellectual, a staunch vegetarian, and an abusive and controlling narcissist. This book is about their love, but of course, this book is really about the magma flowing just beneath the surface of this relationship. Thóra said in an interview with the Scandinavian House in New York, that I'll link to below, she said, quote, "My intention was to explore the undercurrent of love and the obsessive and humiliating manic states a person in love can find herself." And man, does this book do that. It's uncomfortable and frustrating, and it's absolutely necessary. Lilia, our narrator, is young and naive and full of potential, but she falls in love with this man who is unnamed, who really just takes advantage of her in a bunch of different ways. He cheats on her all the time, he's still in love with his ex-girlfriend, who he still talks to frequently, which upsets Lilia, and he pressures Lilia into doing things that she's clearly not comfortable with. All of this is incredibly frustrating to read, and we're often left to ask the very simple and very basic question, why doesn't she just leave him? Why does she stay with him? And these are questions that people always ask people who are in abusive relationships. What Thóra does so well in Magma is explore how abuse, physical and emotional, can create cycles of self-doubt, self-hatred, and in some instances self-harm. After a while of being with this man and going through what she does, Lilia doesn't believe she's even worthy of him, let alone someone else, and of leaving. This abuse starts pretty early in this book, and it's fairly innocuous at the start. This guy just seems like a jerk rather than an abuser. I'll just read this short excerpt from one of the early chapters. He still loves his ex-girlfriend, and they're still close friends. She's elegant and clever. She was at the top of her class in classics in school. They both know Latin. They're both well-read. They toss Derrida quotes around like it's nothing. The other day, he asked me to meet him at a coffee house, so it was more than a little strange that he was sitting with her when I arrived. I felt humiliated, and I wanted to leave, to turn around and walk straight out, to disappear, but they'd already spotted me. I had to sit with them. It was one of the most uncomfortable afternoons of my life. So as you can see, this behavior is fairly innocuous at the start, but you can see how this would affect Lilia. And in fact, this conversation goes on to start talking about all of these violent sexual acts that makes Lilia very uncomfortable. But what we see in this scene is how Lilia's self-doubts about her relationship become fortified and reiterated by the actions of her boyfriend. We then get this very short chapter about how he invited her to go to a bar, but she couldn't make it. Later that night, she feels really guilty about not being able to meet up with him for drinks, so she goes to his house to sleep over. But when she enters the house, she finds a pair of high heels on the doormat. She vows to never speak to him again, and then we get these two extremely short chapters called Willpower 1 and Willpower 2, and they just simply say, he called, left a message, but I was a Teflon woman. Everything slid off me. For about 15 minutes. From here, it dissolves more and more to the point where she becomes so socially anxious that he gets jealous when I meet my friends, and I'm afraid I'll give away how crazy I've become. So it's just easier for both of us if I stay home with him. He begins cheating more and more, and he begins to blame her for his cheating. He tells her that she needs to quit smoking, and that for every subsequent cigarette that she smokes, he'll sleep with 8 women. Sex and loyalty become commodities and bargaining chips, and it seems like Lilia has no control over this, though she seems to firmly believe that eventually her boyfriend will give in and just love her alone. And I won't read the section, but we learn in the first 1/3 of this book that Lilia is a survivor of sexual assault, and we just get this very, very brief chapter in which she confesses this experience to us, and then she sort of just moves on. But the ephemerality of this, the name of the chapter is Ephemera, just makes it all the more powerful as we're left to contemplate the juxtaposition between the ephemeral nature of some of these acts and the long-lasting and enduring effects of those very acts. One thing that this book is really interested in that I alluded to earlier is how past traumas bubble beneath the surface of individuals, and they, like magma, threaten to erupt at any minute. And we see this with both Lilia and her boyfriend. As we learn more and more about them and their past is revealed to us, we start to learn how they've both suffered all of these various traumas in their life. And there are just 2 quick moments that I want to read that are just very poetic and explore this idea quite a bit. The first is a quick chapter called Love. He's peeled me like an onion, surrounded by the leavings of my own sallow skin. I've dwindled to nothing, and my eyes smart. And the next passage is from another very short chapter called Special Place. And it says, our love is raw. We trust each other down to the core, something nobody in my life has ever come close to. When I feel as if I flayed myself with a potato peeler, I remind myself, love is a spectrum. It is as painful as it is wonderful. And I just find these 2 passages so interesting because the predominant metaphor of magma bubbling beneath the surface is here expressed in these two images of potatoes and onions, of food. And the abuse and the trauma that she's going through is peeling away the shell that, well, every person has to create in order to function in this world, and it's exposing her. This food imagery, I think, is so powerful because it brings with it the positive connotations of preparing food, of domesticity, etc., alongside this brutal imagery of consumption and of flaying away someone's skin and leaving them raw. Magma is a really beautiful book with so much poetry in its pages, And it's a really powerful book that you can read in one sitting, but it's not an easy read by any means. I had to put the book down a few different times and take a break from it. It's also an incredibly frustrating book, but I think that's part of the point. This book begs us to feel empathy rather than ask the knee-jerk and basic question, why didn't you just leave? That society always asks people in abusive relationships. The subject matter too is so urgent and important, and the language of this book just has this poetic beauty that juxtaposes the subject matter so effectively. I'm really looking forward to seeing what other kind of work Þóra Hjörleifsdóttir does in the future, and I'm actually really inclined to go and check out her poetry. But for now, thanks for watching.